What up? My name's Minimme, my name's actually Peter. If you're new here, welcome. If you're not new here, welcome. I don't know how to start videos, I don't know any catchphrases or anything, but basically we're looking at every single DS FPS game that ever came out on the DS in order of release. This is essentially a glorified first impressions video. Like, I didn't play all these games to completion, I played them long enough to get a real good feel for them. And at the end of the video, I'm gonna rank them all, and it's gonna be a good old time. So I hope you stick around. I hope you're curious to see all these monstrosities. They're not that bad. And a couple of things before we get started. I'm not gonna look at rail shooters like Point Blank and Touch the Dead because they're kind of FPS games, but you know, they're kind of not. And I'm not gonna look at games that have FPS bits but aren't FPSs, which includes Resident Evil and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But aside from that, I think we're good to go. I hope you enjoy the video, and yeah. The first taste of the DS FPS is the aptly named Metroid Prime Hunter's First Hunt, which was a launch title and is simply a demo for the full Hunters game. This was one of those package deal games that came with your DS back in the day, and it served as sort of a tech demo and a proof of concept for the first-person shooter on the DS because it was quite good. It had 3 short single-player modes. The first being the main attraction is a 10-minute level that wasn't in the full game, which showed off general gameplay. The second is a simple endless survival mode, and the third is a dull mode where you simply play a level as the Morph Ball. There's also local multiplayer, which has 3 maps, which are cool because they're basically early versions of maps in the final game. First Hunt doesn't feature bots though like the main game, so you need friends to try the multiplayer, and who has friends when you have a YouTube channel? What's great about this demo is just how graphically impressive it is and how smooth it feels. Obviously, being as old as it is, it's quite rudimentary, but the touchscreen aiming and smooth frame rate is still impressive for what it is, though it does look and feel a fair bit different to the final release. Controls like this hadn't really been tried before, and for it to feel immediately natural is just remarkable. As it stands, that's all that can really be said about First Hunt because it is just a demo. We'll dig deeper into the full version when we get to it. The first full FPS game to land on the DS was the handheld version of Goldeneye Rogue Agent, which came out in June of 2005. I've always had an undeserved soft spot for the main version of this game, so seeing this version was cool because they did try to cram basically all the mechanics from the main game into it. It has dual wielding, it has the Goldeneye abilities, it has taking hostages, and it has activatable traps, which enemy AI even use in single player, which is actually really cool. I even recognize some of the levels from the main game. Also, just quickly, I sometimes think about this stupid fucking game because it's called Goldeneye, but it has nothing to do with the game Goldeneye or anything to do with the film Goldeneye. It's called Goldeneye because the guy you play as literally has a golden eye. As far as how this plays, it feels like an early 2000s budget shooter, complete with terrible AI, you know, the baddies always stop to reload, the guns have no kick or impact, and it's all a bit of a hit-scanny mess with bad hit detection. I guess a budget shooter is kind of exactly what this is, but in the context that this is the first full DS FPS game, there is some merit to this. Again, it's a decent looking game for the DS with a smooth frame rate, the levels are surprisingly large, and there's often a lot of enemies on screen at once. It also has a multiplayer mode which seems pretty good and helps fill out the package because the single player is quite short and you can play the multiplayer alone with bots. Aside from being just kind of bland and rushed feeling, another area where Rogue Agent doesn't really succeed is the controls. Don't get me wrong, the whole touchscreen to aim thing still works great, but because Rogue Agent is trying to have dual wielding, it's created a problem for itself. By default, you're meant to use the thumb strap stylus if you remember that thing, so that way you can use both triggers to shoot each gun in each hand, but because that feels horrible, you'll switch back to either the usual stylus mode where you use one trigger to shoot either one or both guns, or you don't even use the touchscreen and you aim with the face buttons, which is even worse and kind of just defeats the point of the whole touchscreen thing. The stylus mode is the way to go, and it isn't terrible, but it is awkward. Otherwise, Rogue Agent is average and only really remarkable for being the first, but even then First Hunt was kind of the first anyway. Another game I have a soft spot for is the main version of Peter Jackson's King Kong, the official game of the movie, or PJKK:TOGOTM for short. Though my love for this game is probably more deserved than Rogue Agent. This also has a DS game that came out in November of 2005, but my god, this makes Goldeneye look like the real Goldeneye. This game is just so awful. It looks bad, it feels bad, all the gameplay is just slowly slugging through areas that all look the same while you fall asleep to the repetitive music trying to find a nugget of entertainment. The movement is so slow and the auto-aim is so generous that you barely feel like you're playing the game, and you spend most of your time just shooting bees and crabs and bugs, and speaking of bugs, it's filled with bugs, and I'm just losing my mind talking about this stupid game. Apparently later on there are brief Kong sections which are slightly better, but I've read that they're not that good either, and I'm just trying to stay awake here. Speaking of bad games, if you're a fan of mine, you might remember that I ranked Greg Hastings' Paintball Tournament Maxed as the second worst GBA FPS game, with only the fabled Medal of Honor Underground below it. This game also came out on the DS in January of 2006, and this time around it's not an incomprehensible slideshow of randomly placed pixels. It's actually okay. It has a neat single player mode where you customize your stuff and beat tournaments and rank up, and I was actually kind of entranced by the idea of a Virtua Tennis style travel the world campaign wrapped around these bite-sized shooting arenas. Unfortunately, the more I played it, the quicker it wore thin. Hit detection and AI are both a little rough, and you seem to bump off objects when you touch them, which is strange, but otherwise this game is kind of neat and has some tense moments. They tried to capture the sport as much as they could with leaning and going prone and all that, but with the DS's controls it all feels a bit too much. The only thing this game has really done is make me want to play the full Xbox or PS2 version of it to see what the campaign is like, but as it stands, Greg Hastings' Paintball Tournament Maxed is just kind of a thing that exists that's okay, and it tries really hard to convince you that paintball is cool.
You want it easy, but you never want to take it from me. You'll never make it in this game. I know the truth is all you backtrack on what you say, and every day you changing up, homie, then I need to show you the way.
March of 2006 finally saw the release of Metroid Prime Hunters, about 1.5 years after First Hunt. I'm pretty sure this was the first FPS game I ever played on the DS, like it was either this or COD 4, and in both cases I was pretty blown away. This feels amazing to play, which I guess isn't surprising at this point considering the demo wrote the book on DS FPS controls, but considering how good this game looks, it's just remarkable that it's so smooth to play. Just like how Metroid Prime pushed the GameCube to its limits, Metroid Prime Hunters pushes the DS to its limits. I only ever played this on friends' DS's back in the day, and all I ever remember playing was the multiplayer, which was really well done, making this game the only game on the list where I've properly tried the multiplayer with real people, even if it's just some vague childhood memories. Hunters was actually the first DS FPS to have online multiplayer, and including online multiplayer was the reason Hunters was delayed from 2005 to 2006. This allowed the dev team to really polish the game up in a lot of ways, with the main way being the amazing graphics, but graphics aside, and considering the multiplayer is offline, the single player mode is actually really boring. Like once you're past the initial honeymoon factor of this game, man does it get repetitive. Fights frequently go on for minutes longer than they should, and the boss battles are just so bad, like so bad that how are these not edited out? It's confusing. It's a real shame because Hunters feels really good to play, which is why the multiplayer was so good, but the single player, at least in my opinion, is completely wasted. Still, Hunters is remarkable in a lot of ways, and perhaps, unfortunately, it's a lot better than most of the games on this list still. 2006's final DS FPS came out in November as Bionicle Heroes, which is surprisingly pretty decent, I guess. It feels very standard and it doesn't take many risks. You go through straightforward levels shooting down other Bionicles and picking up bits of Lego at a reasonable pace. There's not really a lot to say. I mean, it's very long, it has a local multiplayer mode, and for some reason it's rated T for teen in the States for fantasy violence, even though all other versions of Bionicle Heroes got a lower rating. That seems really crazy. Like, Bionicle's target audience are younger than teenagers, and clearly this is fine for them. At least it isn't our Aussie classification board. I heard they banned the game entirely. The only thing I really didn't like about Bionicle Heroes is the controls, which feel really sticky and gross with the stylus, and vertical sensitivity is way higher than horizontal, so I actually switched it over to aiming with the face buttons, which undermines exactly what's so good about FPSs on the DS with the controls. I'd say it ruins this game for me, but really I wasn't expecting anything, and if anything, Bionicle Heroes surpassed my expectations. I've talked about Mantium before on this channel in a 5 graphically impressive video because it looks great. It does some interesting things with lighting and somehow runs at 60 frames, and while I wouldn't call it a great game, it really nails its atmosphere. Developed by a studio named Renegade Kid, who will return later, and released in October of 2007, Dementium was originally pitched as a Silent Hill game, and you can see why. They really get that PS1 sort of horror ambience down here, and it can be genuinely quite unsettling. It's supported by a pretty okay game too. They didn't go all in on making this an FPS, which I think is smart. It feels like a horror adventure game just as much as a shooter, and it feels much more thoughtful than most other games on this list. Like, it is clunky and it is budgety, especially with the reused assets, but for what it's worth, I think this game has aged far better than most on this list because it's kind of a lo-fi horror game, and I dig that. Dementium is worth a look. Like I said earlier, the other FPS game I remember on the DS from when I was a kid is Call of Duty 4, released in November of 2007. It's the first of 5 very similar Call of Duty games on the DS, and they were off to a good start. It's funny going back to this actually because it kind of blew my mind when I was a kid, but nowadays it's just a bunch of blocky polygons like everything else on this list, but it is super impressive for the time, and they did kind of pull off the signature Call of Duty scripted campaign with heaps of explosions and stuff going on, which is quite remarkable. The best thing about this game, in my opinion, is how the guns feel. Like, they have that COD recoil and aim down sights as a thing, and probably most importantly, they cause huge particle effects wherever they hit, so you always know where you're shooting and that it's having an impact. Compare this to something like Rogue Agent from earlier and it's night and day. Those guns may as well be firing blanks. Weirdly, this version of COD 4 doesn't have online multiplayer. It has local multiplayer, but the main draw of the main version of COD 4 was always scoring 420 no-scopes and abusing martyrdom and last stand in multiplayer. Of course, the DS is all offline now and it doesn't matter anymore, but had I owned this back then, this would have disappointed me. Still, this is a really impressive product and they've done a great job. Weirdly, in 2008, the only FPS that came out was World at War, about a year after Modern Warfare. We usually get about 2 or 3 a year, but 2008 was coincidentally quieter. Maybe there was like a global financial crisis or something, who knows. World at War is essentially a World War II themed coat of paint on COD 4 DS, but that ain't a bad thing. It controls virtually the same. I think the guns feel a little more punchy and it looks slightly better and more dense geometrically. Interestingly, these games don't try and copy the campaigns of the main versions, instead they tell simple side stories to the main games. This was probably the right move, but if you know me, you know I love seeing devs try and basically demake games like with Driver 3 GBA or Max Payne GBA, but they only kind of do that with these COD games, which is slightly disappointing to me, but most normal people wouldn't care about that at all. Regardless, it's a good game for what it is, and they added online multiplayer, making it the second game so far to have that. It doesn't have the most iconic thing that World at War did though with the zombies mode, but not to worry, that will come later. Along with Dementium, another Renegade Kid that I've talked about on the channel before is Moon. Released in January of 2009, this game often comes up in conversations as being potentially the most graphically impressive DS game ever made, and you can tell why. As it runs at 60 frames, it has top tier texture quality, and it has some super dense geometry. I only played it briefly before making this video, and having played it more now, I'm a bit split on how much I like it. On the one hand, like Dementium, Moon is much more thoughtful than its contemporaries. They do a lot more than just simple combat room after room, like they're trying to tell a story and it has adventure game elements, and with the gadgets and level design they dip into puzzles just as much as they do combat. Also, the atmosphere is really well defined, just like Dementium, which is no easy task on the DS. On the other hand though, Moon is really boring. It's another game that falls apart after the initial wow factor. The combat, while not being the worst thing in the world thanks to some weapon variety, is just far too slow, and the enemies are super static and boring. Movement speed feels like it should be doubled, though it probably wasn't due to tech limitations, and the level design just gets ultra repetitive really quickly. Reusing puzzles over and over is always boring, and there's just a bit of key hunting and backtracking which makes me feel so lost and so bored. Moon will often present like a really interesting idea, and then it'll sort of waterboard you with that idea until you really hate that idea and you just want to turn the game off, but still there's a lot of merit here, and it's just a game that's desperately in need of an editor, I think. There's not a lot of information online about Core. It was released in August of 2009 by both a relatively unknown developer and a relatively unknown publisher. It came out to completely warranted poor reviews, no one really played it, and I guess it just sort of died the way it lived. Graphically, it's actually quite good on the tech side, and without sounding like a broken record, I've talked about this game before, and I've heard that the local multiplayer was pretty good, but otherwise this is not a good game. The best comparison I can make is that this feels like Rogue Agent but with less going for it. The AI are bad, the guns feel terrible, and the level design is just uninspired and confusing. It does get its ambience down pretty well, and again its graphics are so good that it feels like there might have been some potential here, but nothing it tries really works out. Call of Duty Modern Warfare Mobilized is the weird name for the Modern Warfare 2 DS game from November of 2009. This is predictably just like the others, featuring fantastic graphics and audio and a campaign that is a side story to Modern Warfare 2. If you liked the others, you'd like this, and just like the others, it's carried by its production value, its pace, and its feel. I wandered around a few multiplayer maps in this one just to try and get a feel for what it would have been like, and I actually think it would have been pretty fun. After a sorta rough year for DS FPS games, at least it ended with another good Call of Duty game. Mantium II is where Renegade Kid finally found their footing with these FPS games. Mantium was pretty good and Moon was a bit of a snore fest, but Mantium II released in May of 2010 and it's really a step above anything they'd released before. You can tell they've always tried to make something with more depth and considerate design than most of the games they're competing with, but it wasn't until now that I feel that it came together properly. As usual, it looks stunning, with enemy models being particularly good. Like, this may well be the most impressive DS game ever made, and they've really upped the level variety and production value on this one. Though it still does a bit, it doesn't usually get hung up in one spot as much, and again the lo-fi grainy sort of PS1 atmosphere is just outstanding and unlike anything else on the DS, bar the first game. It still doesn't have top tier combat or gameplay really, but it makes up for it elsewhere and it's worth a look if you're interested. This is Renegade Kid's third game and final FPS they made, which I think is a shame because Mantium II is teetering on being a great game. These guys were on a trajectory where they were really refining how they made FPS games with every release, and I think if they had better hardware to work with, focused up their gameplay a bit and released a few more games like this, maybe they could have struck some sort of horror or sci-fi gold. As it stands, Mantium II really is quite good. If you're like me, then when you think of the Nintendo DS, your mind always goes straight to hunting. Cabela's Dangerous Hunts 2011 came out the year before in 2010 for whatever reason, and you can probably understand why I wasn't expecting too much from this one. Like, it's quite ugly, and it's a hunting game, and it's a DS FPS game, so right off the bat, doesn't have a lot going for it, and considering how little there is online about this, it's fair to say that most people were completely uninterested. But rednecks, listen up. This game is actually relatively good. Relatively being the key word, of course, but it controls like a Call of Duty game with sprinting, ADS, and recoil, and it's more of a linear survival action game than a hunting game. It moves forward at a good pace, levels are large and well modeled, and it even has some fun minigames, including a very typical but still fun shooting gallery. Animals have different but predictable attacking styles, and it's a good shake-up compared to the usual AI enemies on the DS, but a lot of the animals charge at you for their attacks and clip through you and I guess land behind you, so you'll find yourself spinning around all the time, which isn't ideal. The DS touchscreen is great for precise aiming, and you will do that in this, but when you have to spin around a lot, it becomes pretty cumbersome pretty quick, but you know, that's my biggest complaint, so Dangerous Hunts 2011 is far better than it should be. It's fairly challenging, you actually need to be a good shot to preserve ammo, and it's generally just a pretty good game by DS FPS standards, which is really surprising and still blowing my mind. The name of the developers behind all of these Call of Duty games is N-Space, and they were tasked to do the Goldeneye remake on the DS, so naturally this feels like a Call of Duty game, which is just like the console version of Goldeneye, and this has a similar level of polish to all the DS COD games so far. However, Goldeneye isn't quite as good, and it's hard to put a finger on exactly why that is. The gunplay comes across as a bit less refined, bullets don't seem to always impact enemies properly, and the pace just feels a bit slower than the Call of Duty games. Also, this poor frame rate isn't just the emulation. On actual hardware, it can get this bad too, which really doesn't feel great, but generally this is still a fairly decent product, all things considered. What interests me about this game is that unlike the COD games, this actually tries to be a handheld version of the main game. It has most of the levels and recreates them in its own demake sort of way, and you know that's always fascinating to me. It's kind of funny thinking about what this product is. Like, GoldenEye 2010 was a remake of an N64 game, and this is a demake of that remake to fit on handhelds that is arguably about as technically competent as an N64 or as the N64 game. Like, it's just this weird, it's just weird to think about, but you know, it's an alright game, and I rate it kinda. Light rate, I'm thinking a 6/6 Fantano, a light 6 to a strong 5. I don't know what I'm saying anymore. Next game. A week after Goldeneye came out at the start of November, N-Space put out another Call of Duty game. It was a busy week for N-Space. They came out with 4 games total, including the third-person shooter 007 Bloodstone. Black Ops is very similar to the last few COD games, and it's probably the best one yet. Apparently a lot of work was put into the multiplayer mode where they added a lot of new features, including perks, so that's really cool, and it has a ton of game modes, and what I like about this one is that they finally added zombies, which is something that really should have been in World at War. It doesn't feature any of the same maps as the main game, and it only supports up to 2 players, but it is really well done, and it would have been a fun thing to play at school or something back in the day. I know I would have played it because I used to sit in class playing the COD Zombies mode on my iPod Touch. Does anyone remember that? Leave me a comment. Go down into the comments and type "I remember that" if you remember that, because that thing was great. Finally, and fittingly, we've come to the very last game on our journey of DS FPS mediocrity, which came out a year afterwards as Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 Defiance. If you're drinking anything right now, put the drink down. I want you to strap yourselves in for a mind-blowing discovery. This game, Modern Warfare 3 Defiance, is just like all the others. I know, amazing. It's a side story, and they made improvements to the multiplayer, but there's less game modes than Black Ops, and there's no zombies, so I don't think it's quite as good, but still it's as good as ever, and I just think if you were playing FPS games on the DS in 2011, you'd probably be happy with anything. And that's the video, and I'm putting glasses on now, and I'm swishing my hair back. And hope you enjoyed it, and now we're going to rank every single game that we looked at. Essentially this list is meaningless, and I kind of gave points to Metroid because I played the multiplayer and I didn't play the multiplayer in any of the others, so it's completely unfair. But stick around, you know, you might have something to argue with in the comments. Alright, so I've got the list up here, which is why I'm wearing these glasses. The worst game on my list is King Kong, and if you're surprised by that, did you even watch the video? Number 11 is Core, which I think has potential, but was just kind of boring in every way. Number 10 is Bionicle Heroes, which I know I said I liked, but I had really low expectations for it. And the fact that the controls don't really work and you have to play with the like digital controls basically, kind of ruins the whole experience, which is a bit of a shame, right? Number 9 is Goldeneye Rogue Agent, which, what do I have to say about Bionicle? The only reason Goldeneye Rogue Agent is above Bionicle is because I recognize the levels in it, and I think that's kind of cool, like, you know me. Number 8 is Moon, which I'd love to put higher, but unfortunately is just really boring. Like, I want to like it, but I don't. Number 7, Greg Hastings Paintball Tournament Maxed, you know, the most gangster paintball game going around in 2006 or 5 or whenever this came out. That game is surprisingly alright, you know, it's not that bad. It has a very interesting concept, it plays pretty well, you know, it's just a bit, it's a bit one key, which I guess isn't surprising for a paintball game, and a bit sort of wonky and janky and wanky. Number 6 is Goldeneye 007, the remake, which is alright. It's a bit slow, it's a Call of Duty game, but slowed down, but I liked that it had the levels from the main game, and you know, it's decent. Number 5 is Cabela's Dangerous Hunts, which really shouldn't be this high, but it is. You know, I enjoyed that. I actually kind of want to put that one higher, part of me wants to, but you know, the ones above it deserve their spot. Number 4 is Mantium II, which probably now are starting to teeter into the games that are worth sort of giving a look if you're interested. Like, Mantium I is still not super enjoyable or anything, but if you're like into like, I don't know, gaming history, or you just want to see the DS pull some things off, Mantium I's a cool place to start doing that. Check it out. Not an amazing game, but very, very successful at what it does, I think. Number 3 is Metroid Prime Hunters, which I know I said is really boring, and I kind of gave it more points for playing the multiplayer, but it looks fantastic, right? Like, it just looks amazing. The multiplayer was really good. But the main thing about Metroid Prime Hunters that is so good is that it controls so damn well. Like, far better than anything else on this list, I'd argue. Anything above it or below it. It just, the feel of that game outweighs every other game that it has to be like a top tier FPS game on the DS. And that's kind of bad because it speaks to the standards of DS FPS games. None of them are really outstanding, right? Which is a bit of a shame, but you know, whatever. That's not surprising. Number 2 is all of the Call of Duty games, which I've lumped into one because they're so damn similar. I think they had a really good production value. They're quite impressive for the system, even though they have poor frame rate at times. There's not really a lot to say about them. It's just kind of cool that they exist. I liked that they kept trying to create Call of Duty campaigns on the DS, and they did, for the most part, keep pulling them off. And then number 1, the best game of them all, which you probably know, is Mantium II. Mantium DOS is Mantium, but far, far better. Has a lot of interesting ideas. It feels like it's very... The first one I feel like felt like a Silent Hill clone, which, I mean, it was pitched as a Silent Hill game, so of course it is. But Mantium II, they were like, alright, we're making a sequel. We can kind of just have complete creative freedom and do whatever we want. And they did whatever they wanted, and I think it's a real success. But even as the best FPS DS game, I don't know if I'd say it's super worth playing, you know. I think these games are very much worth, like the top level games are very much worth seeking out if you're interested, but if you're not interested, there's nothing really of value in them, right? Like, if you like seeing this stuff running on a DS, or if you want to try an FPS on the DS, that's where you should go. But they're not good enough to be standalone great FPS games. Like, obviously they're not Halo, they're not Half-Life, you know, they're not Counter-Strike or the real Call of Duty games or whatever's good these days, Doom 2016 or Wolfenstein 2014. The sequel wasn't very good. Yeah, so that's my wrap up, that's my analysis. Hope you enjoyed the video. It's indicative. When are you gonna do a Moto Racer DS 100% playthrough? That's a very obscure thing for just my Discord users. Hope you enjoyed the video. Have a good one. Take it easy. Hope you're well. Bye.